Let's bring into the conversation now for more analysis William Lee, who is a chief economist at Global Economic Advisors. He is with us live this morning from Los Angeles. Bill, we appreciate you being here. Look, beyond what we just said there, who is Kevin Warsh? How is he viewed within economic circles?
He is really a fantastic economist. In fact, if he were to be appointed chair, I think he's going to be the most important chair of the Federal Reserve since Paul Volcker, because he really has very strong opinions about what the central bank should be doing, and it's not what the Federal Reserve is doing today. He's very convinced that the Fed has overstepped its boundaries. For example, its balance sheet is way larger than it should be. In fact, he quit the Board of Governors because he disagreed with Ben Bernanke about expanding the balance sheet even more, what was called QE2 back then. He felt that the central bank really should step out of the way of the private sector. And I think what you'll find surprising, if he is to be appointed, is that even if he were to lower interest rates quickly, he's going to offset that by contracting the balance sheet, which means that the inflationary impact of a very sharp decline in rates can really be offset by contracting the balance sheet. And I think you'll find that kind of maneuver on the part of Kevin Warsh. And that's why I think he's going to be a really significant change in the way the Fed does business.
So a smaller balance sheet, but perhaps lower rates. How does that impact people at home, Bill?
Yeah, it's going to help people get their mortgages, and small businesses will be able to get their loans at a lower rate. But at the same time, the banks will find it more difficult to lend because the size of the balance sheet that's providing the liquidity for banks to do lending is going to be pulled back. So we have, in some sense, two things that can offset one another. And I think day-to-day life will be a lot easier in the sense that the complaints about interest rates being too high can be handled, but at the same time, the financial markets fear that low rates will spur inflation can also be handled. So if he does this right, I think he can actually square that circle and come out smelling good on both sides.
Bill, it's interesting. You paint a rosy picture of what he might be able to do if he does this right, to your point. So then how do you explain the market reaction we've seen overnight? You have S&P futures lower, Dow futures off, NASDAQ futures off, and yields on the 10-year and the 30-year higher. How do you interpret that? What's happening here?
A lot of the stock market reaction that we're seeing right now is a holdover from what happened with the AI fears that Microsoft is spending so much money on infrastructure that people are worried that they're not going to see any returns from it. So a lot of that stock market reaction, I think, is over that kind of specific situation and not related to monetary policy. As far as interest rates and the dollar is concerned, that there's a global problem right now, which is that Japan has really been under the microscope insofar as whether it can actually have expansionary fiscal policy, given that Japan's debt burden is way larger than the United States. Well, their debt to GDP ratio is more than 200% of GDP, as opposed to like 100% for the United States. So interest rates and the dollar are much more influenced by global changes. And the stock market is very specific changes in the AI worries out there. But as far as monetary policy is concerned and fear of Fed independence, Kevin Warsh, I think, would be a very smart way to square the circle and really present a new approach to the dilemma that the Fed faces right now.
Yeah, speaking of Fed independence, I mean, this has been really remarkable to sort of watch the relationship between the White House and the central bank, between Powell and Trump. Do you believe, and is the belief on Wall Street that Kevin Warsh can sort of, stand up to President Trump the way we've seen Powell and Powell sort of does it in his own way. But do you believe that he will also be seen as a continuation of that Fed independence?
Well, Kevin Warsh is a man of convictions. He quit his job as a governor because he really disagreed with Ben Bernanke's approach to monetary policy. So he's not afraid of voicing opinions, but he does it on the inside. And as far as the criticism of Fed independence is concerned, again, I want to remind the audience that it's not about taking away independent monetary policy. What President Trump has been trying to do is say the Fed mission creep, the Fed bloat, has been enormous over the last 20 years. Their budget has quadrupled when, faster than the rise in federal expenditures. And Kevin Warsh feels the same way, that the Fed has really gone way beyond its mandate. And I think you're going to have a meeting of minds in terms of both parties wanting to have administrative accountability of the Fed, but in terms of monetary policy independence and bank supervision independence, that's going to be left alone.
Economist Bill Lee in Los Angeles, thank you for being here this morning.
Thanks for having me.